Welcome to Compose Yourself, the podcast where academic writing meets self-discovery for the students at the Chicago School.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Cindy.
Whether you're crafting your first essay or refining your voice as a writer, we're here to guide you through the art of composition.
From brainstorming to final drafts, we'll break down the tools and techniques to help you think critically, write effectively, and express yourself with confidence.
So, grab a pen, open your mind, and
compose yourself.
All right, welcome to Module 2. In this week's video, we will dive a bit deeper into the link between the writing process and identity. We will discuss a few different ways to brainstorm and talk about annotating a text by looking at the Du Bois reading. So, last week, everyone had a chance to start or begin the writing process through brainstorming. And we did this with your notebook assignment. We kind of also did this in the discussion. So we already played around with a few different techniques or different ideas. And this helped you lead to the development of your rough draft. So Cindy, what are some of your brainstorming techniques?
Yeah, one thing I really like to do when I'm starting to work on a writing project is I do like to do free writing, like we talked about in the Module 1 video. So just sitting down, I like to set a timer. So I'll set a timer for 5 or 10 minutes, and I like to use paper and pen. So I just sit down, paper and pen, and the key is to not lift your pen the whole time. It's just free write, meaning whatever comes to your mind, whether it's I don't want to do this assignment. I don't really know what to say. I'm thinking about this reading we did and it didn't make sense. Just get going, and eventually you'll start to come up with some things. You'll start to see what's interesting to you. The other thing I really think is helpful that's often underrated is reading. So if you have to write, I think it's a good idea to sort of prime yourself by doing a little bit of reading. So if you have to write about something, doing that reading initially and then giving yourself what I like to call the sort of underappreciated brainstorming technique, which is time. So I think one of the most important things that we need when we're trying to generate ideas or trying to think of what we want to pull out of a reading that we did so that we can talk about that when we write is that time. You need some time for your brain to do its really special work where it's problem solves while you're not really even directly thinking about it. So giving yourself some
Great.
time between reading and writing, I think is important. And lastly, I like to use AI for brainstorming. So I might use ChatGPT to help me think about some topics related to something, or ask me some, I might prompt it to ask me some questions about something that will help me get going. I really think AI can be a good thinking partner in this way. I also wouldn't underestimate the value of talking to another person. So students could talk to each other, or they could talk to someone in the Office of Student Writing and Learning to kind of get ideas going. Never undervalue talking about your project with somebody else.
I love that idea in particular. It may annoy those around me, but I will talk their ears off. And the nice thing I like about that one in particular is that they don't have the context that you do, right? Like we're staring at an assignment sheet or a prompt, and we're embedded with, maybe all of the different things that you've read, and you're trying to bring it all together. And then somebody on the outside, if it's AI or even in particular a real person, they don't have that context. They don't know. But that gives them a leg up because something that may be clear to you isn't clear to them. Or vice versa, something that's confusing to you because you're kind of in the weeds and overwhelmed, they might see it more clearly and kind of help you dialogue and work through that issue. So I really love that one. I've also had students, it really depends upon what kind of project you're doing.
Mhm.
So for narratives, I've had quite a few students use storyboarding, and there's all kinds of online software and stuff, or just good old-fashioned pen and paper. You make the squares, scene one, scene two, scene three, almost like you're making a comic or a TV show. But they've used storyboarding. And let's see, I'm going to share one thing we're going to look at. This is pretty old. Is called Freytag's Pyramid. Let's give it a second. There we go. And there's some pretty big words on here, so I don't expect everybody to, master this. This is a German guy from the 1800s, and he developed this concept of a plot structure. So how do the sequence of events work in a narrative? And this is what he came up with. Of course, there's a million different formats. There's different ways of organizing, but this is kind of the classic bread and butter. If you're making a narrative, you can do this. The only word I really want to talk about, well, I guess three, is that the exposition right here is kind of like your introduction. So that's where you will let people know who the characters are, what the setting is, and kind of just what's going on. You're giving them that space to enter into your narrative. Um, the biggest one is the climax. And so you'll notice even on your assignment sheet that we talk about the tension and the resolution of the tension. And what we mean by that is the climax is where everything changes. It's kind of the big thing. And after the climax, suddenly everything is different. So for you, that would be, that moment when you really reflected upon and realized that you had to change or adapt your language to speak to or communicate with this new group. And then the resolution is your conclusion. That's the so what? What happened afterwards? Why is what happened in your conclusion, what happened after this climax, different from the exposition? So the only reason I'm really sharing this is that it can also be a really powerful brainstorming tool when you're writing narratives, is just to kind of make this little pyramid and start with maybe a word or a couple of words saying, all right, what happened in my introduction? What happened at that moment of change, that climax, what happened at the end. And then you kind of use that sequencing of events to fill in the gaps. How do I get from introduction to climax, and how do I get from climax to conclusion? So that's just a really neat tool that I wanted to share. Um, have you ever used the pyramid before?
Yes, I also think it sort of ends up mimicking what you do in most writing. It's you have to have an introduction. You have to tell the reader some context about what's happening. And then you're going to have to build. So I think about even when students will do things like literature reviews, you have to introduce topics before you get to sort of that climax, which is the main research that you've done, like the most important thing. You have to give the background. You do that main research. And then you start talking about, okay, so why is this meaningful to what I'm interested in? I just think that sometimes we overcomplicate writing as structurally, but really, if we think about it, it always needs to take that logical path. So I really like that sort of visual representation of what writing for a reader has to look like.
And it's really also in that sense, like you said, not that different from an outline, right? Like this
Correct.
this is more applicable to a narrative, but it's the same concept as an outline, and
Right.
that most people are familiar with. Um, so that brings us back then to, we're talking about the writing process, and we're thinking, all right, the very first step is brainstorming. We brainstorm a few times. When writing gets more complicated, there will be a few additional steps, but we're not there right now. And then you move on to your very first draft. And that finished out module one. But you're not finished there, right? There's still more steps. So this week, they're going to engage in a peer review. And that's kind of part of the drafting, review, and revision process. So when you think about peer review, why do you think it is a part of the writing process? Like, why can't you just write by yourself, never show anybody, and be done?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember about all writing is that we it's meant to be shared, right? In composition or in when we write for school, when we write a story, it's meant to be shared with a reader. That's part of the magic of producing writing. So when we do peer review, it's putting your writing out there to somebody, to a reader, and a reader can tell you what you said. What did you actually say? Because as a writer, we only know what we think we said. This is why often I'll read a student's paper and they'll have a word that's the wrong word. It's not misspelled, but it's the wrong word. And when I read it out loud to them, they're like, oh, why did I write that? Or it's a fragment sentence and they missed part of their idea and they're like, why did I do that? Well, it's because you know what you think you said. It made sense to you at the time because
Hey.
we're in our head when we're writing, right? So I think having that reader, it closes the loop. When we're writing something, it's meant to be shared. We need a reader to tell us where are the gaps, what makes sense and what doesn't. I think peer review is so important because it really helps us sort of complete the circle of a piece of writing. We need a reader.
And I've seen that too. I like your mention of the gaps, because I've seen that in more complicated academic writing. Is that, we're making a lot of logical claims. And so not trying to get too deep into the philosophy of logic, but we'll say things like, well, A
Hmm.
equals B, B equals C, C equals D, therefore A equals D. That's kind of a chain of logical reasoning. But sometimes in our heads, especially when we're writing, we'll say, well, A equals B, B equals D, therefore A equals D. And it makes sense to us. We get the connection. But then in peer review, our reader looks at it and they say, "Hey, where's C? I don't get how you jump
Right.
from here to there. You're missing something."
Yes.
I make that a lot where I missed out on that chain of logic or that chain of reasoning. And it's the reader who can point it out and help me flesh out my argument a little more, explain things, make those connections stronger. I've seen that a lot in academic writing.
Yes. And I think the best thing that you can do for really as a peer reviewer, like looking at somebody else's writing, is formulate those questions. What questions do you
Mhm.
have? If there's a gap somewhere in the narrative, you're going to have a question about it. If there's, if their logical path isn't really going, in a linear way, you're going to have a question about that. So I
Right.
think as a
Same.
peer reviewer, the most valuable thing you can do is ask the writer questions because then they know where their gaps are.
Exactly. Absolutely. So that kind of, at this level right now, that kind of completes the writing process overall, is the brainstorming, you create your first draft, you have peer review, but then you yourself are doing a review, or maybe you go to the writing center. And so you create multiple more drafts and you refine, 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 and then you arrive at that final product that you submit. But this really then leads into a question. What does identity have to do with the writing process? Right? And it's kind of a tricky question because for this assignment, identity is the major topic. It's kind of the focus of this assignment. So it's easy to see how identity is related to the writing process because that's what you're brainstorming, that's what you're writing about. Um, but when we think about our discussion last week, where we talked about the link between identity and voice and how that impacts the way that you write, we talked about how free writing as a form of brainstorming is this unfiltered voice, that you're getting almost I don't want to say the most authentic, but the most pure form of your voice in that free writing. And this kind of leads to an issue that I've noticed in a lot of student writing is that as you revise, especially with peer review, there's this feeling that you almost have to get rid of your entire voice, that you have to become very rigid, almost like robot-like. So, in your estimation, do you think that revising your voice changes your identity?
I don't because I think our identities are always multifaceted. So, even just the way we show up in the world is, right? Often we will dress a little bit different if we have to go to a different kind of setting. The way that I might dress if I'm just at home, like sitting on the couch enjoying my television show and my popcorn bowl, I'm probably going to look a certain way, right? And that feels really, and it might actually be the most authentic expression of who I am. But if I'm going to a job interview or I'm going, to a formal event, I'm probably going to dress differently. And that varies from person to person on how different I'm going to do that. But most of us are going to look slightly different. And that's not really a different situation when you're revising for academic voice, let's say. I'm still the same person on the page, but I might go through and decide how I want to present myself as more formal for that situation. I think it's really important to remember that we're not asking students to become mechanical and all sound alike or to have AI make you sound smarter or whatever. It's really just
Right.
looking at the way that you presented yourself and saying, okay, can I remove some contractions? Can I try to think of my reader as someone, that's a little bit more formal? It's not a classmate. It's not my instructor. It's maybe somebody who doesn't know anything about the class or the reason that I'm writing. It's really just rethinking, how am I showing up on this page? Am I showing up as on my couch with my popcorn bowl, or am I showing up as maybe it's a job interview or maybe it's a formal
Mhm.
event. I don't think it's a lot different than that. Does that make sense?
No, I love that analogy. Yeah, because so if free writing, to build upon it, is you in your sweatpants, then formal academic writing, even when you're revising, is you taking off those sweatpants, putting on something more formal, um, and presenting yourself in a different way. But the you never leaves.
Right.
So I like that. I really like that. And we will cover this topic in a little bit more detail in subsequent podcasts where we're going to get into, well, what does it mean for you to actually exist within and communicate to an academic community? But we're not there yet, so we're just teasing. So, kind of with that idea in mind, with thinking about the writing process, with thinking about identity, one final thing we haven't discussed is annotation. And that's a really integral part, especially in college, of the writing process, is that before you really even get your ideas down, before you start organizing, before you create your thesis statement, you need to read. And that's
Hmm.
going to be a prompt. I mean, all the way if you get into grad school or beyond, or even in future courses in your undergrad, you are going to be assigned a task where you have to read a few things and then you have to write and respond to it.
Hmm.
So, annotation then is this idea that you engage with the text. I like saying it's text wrestling. It might be highlighting some things. So, let's say you print off your readings. You might physically highlight, you might write on the sides or on the margins. But the nice thing about the digital world is that we can now do that digitally as well. So, it really is a preference. I'm going to load one of the readings to kind of just give an example. But while I do that, what are your favorite ways to annotate?
Well, I'm also always going to be a print person. So I understand and have used tools like PowerNotes. So PowerNotes is a digital note-taking tool that all students at the Chicago School have free access to through the library. So if students are interested in digital annotation, they should certainly navigate to the library and look for that PowerNotes tool. I am not a digital annotator. I like to write with my hand with a pencil. So I often will print things, and I've had students say, well, I prefer to read digitally. But I think it's important to note that part of the way that our brains understand reading and text is that we orient ourselves in it by how far. How much paper is on this side? How many times have we turned the page? What side is it on? What does it look like? So when we scroll to read, our brains really struggle to orient itself spatially in that text. So it could be harder to remember where something was or which
Hey.
thing it was that you were reading. So I like to print. I think that works for me. I also have sort of a toolkit. So if I really like something that someone said or I like an idea, I put a heart in the margin, which is not very complex, but it cues me this is something I like. I like this idea. If I think something's really important, I use an asterisk. I often will ask questions in the margins because that
Mhm.
shows me where there's an interesting idea that I need to look at. I do use, I underline, I don't use highlighters just because I'm not a visual color. I don't need a lot of color. I'm not very artistic in that way, but students who are, they really enjoy that. I think whatever it takes to lasso your own attention
Right.
to engage
Right.
with that text. And if there's a way that you can actually be embodied in your reading, meaning when I'm holding a pencil and I'm turning pages and I'm writing, I'm using my body also as I read. So, any way that you can engage your mind and your body in a reading situation and really get your attention focused so you're engaged with that text, I think it will benefit and you'll see reading comprehension go up a little bit.
I agree. I agree. Um, and so I pulled this up, like I said, this is what everybody's going to read, so I don't want to go too in depth on it. It's a fantastic reading, but I wanted just to point out some examples. That when they have this right here, where it's a different color, and it's italicized, that is the editors of this volume annotating the text, right? They're making certain assumptions or certain ideas or certain observations. Like this is who they think the audience is. He's that Du Bois is writing with a white audience in mind. So they're already starting to think about what the purpose of this text is, who the audience is, what it's trying to achieve or get out of the audience. And then we have the text right here. So the only other final thing I want to point out is that a lot of websites, kind of like you mentioned with our library, they do now have built-in annotation tools. So I've already done that down here. I was kind of questioning as I was reading, why is the word emancipation capitalized? And then I realized, of course, oh, he's talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. So I went and I highlighted the text and I chose a color and I left a note. And then that means that the next time I come to this, I see, oop, I've highlighted this, I click on it, there's my note. And one thing I always tell students is, so when we think about that writing process, we move from, especially when we're having to engage with texts, we start brainstorming, we start reading, we start annotating. And then eventually, the more complex the writing becomes, we start outlining or creating that shell, right? And I tell students, how many times do you want to reread the same text? If you have to read three scholarly papers, which is not a lot, but each of them are dense and each of them are 20 pages long.
Mm.
If you don't annotate, it's going to be a chore to go back and read it again and find that quote or find that piece of evidence that you want to
Hmm.
use. So you're really saving yourself a lot of time as well when you annotate because it's easy to come back to say, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. Bam, I'm going to put it into my outline. So it's not just a part of the process, it's a time saver too.
I totally agree with that. When I do a second pass through a difficult reading, let's say it's a scholarly journal article and it's a little bit
Mhm.
dense, um, it's going to take you a couple of passes at it to
It
really be
is.
able to understand what they're saying often. Um, I do that first reading, I annotate. The second reading, I only read what I annotated because I feel like I've picked out what's important to me, what's important to my topic, what I can use to support my own arguments. And I'm only reading the second pass, I'm only reading what I wrote and what I annotated and what I underlined. So you're right, it totally saves me a lot of time.
And that is about it for today. We've covered, um, the writing process. We've kind of made that link between identity and writing. We dove into annotation and how that can help you in the future. And then, yeah, in future episodes, we'll kind of break these topics down a little more.
Sounds great. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Compose Yourself.
Remember, writing is a process, and every word you write brings you closer to becoming the writer you want to be.
We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that it makes clearer the topics you're exploring in this course. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to your instructor.
Until next time, keep thinking critically
And always compose yourself.